Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. Welcome back. Today, we're diving deep into something that's about to change a bit of the legal profession, the NextGen Bar Exam. So we're calling this NextGen 101. So exciting. If you're a law student, recent graduate, or even a practicing attorney in some jurisdictions, you might be wondering what all this fuss is about. I frequently talk to practicing lawyers and I mentioned there's a new bar exam and they're like, really? A lot of people haven't even heard about it.
Maybe I did hear something about that, but I don't know anything about it. Tell me more.
Tell me more. So we thought we would just start at the beginning because there has been, a lot of discussion about it, a lot of rumors, a lot of misinformation. So let's just really talk about how the game is changing for future lawyers and those trying to get licensed in certain jurisdictions. So let's start with the big picture. What exactly is the NextGen Bar Exam, Alison?
Well, the National Conference of Bar Examiners is completely overhauling how we test law school graduates and other people who are sitting for the bar to see if they're ready to practice law. So they're not kind of just tweaking a few questions, dropping a few things here or there. They're doing a fundamental reimagining of the exam. And this has been going on for quite a while. They've been working on this literally for years now. So the current UBE, it's been standardized for quite a long time now, although I do remember when that came to be as well. But that's kind of a 2-day testing marathon, primarily issue spotting. Can you apply the legal rules in a multiple choice format or in an essay format? There is a PT component, but some of this is carrying over, some of it's not. So the NextGen is cutting the time that you'll be tested from as a standard tester from 2 days to 1.5 days, although we have heard some states might fill that extra time, but that's TBD. And they're changing what it's prioritizing. So it's more skills focused and less memorization, although still some memorization. But the idea, at least, is they're going to try to test things more like you might be doing as a starting attorney and less just issue spotting on topics you might never use in practice.
Yeah. I mean, secure transactions. Who even knows what that is?
Yeah. I mean, really though. Yeah. How many people have actually encountered that in the working world? I mean, the reality is when I took the bar, when I was working, I was a patent litigator. Almost nothing on the exam was remotely relevant to the work that I did on a daily basis. But they're going to bring in these kind of skills. We have a list. Let's just go through them. They're going to be testing legal research and writing, issue spotting and analysis, so that's pretty standard, investigation and evaluation, client counseling and advising, negotiation and dispute resolution, and client relationship management. So that probably sounds pretty different, right, Lee?
Yeah. I think if you've been doing a lot of clinics or doing some classes in law school that maybe are a bit more practical or I remember taking alternative dispute resolution where the whole class was basically pretending like we were doing alternative dispute resolution. Some of these skills might sound very familiar, but if I was a law student, I might be scratching my head a little bit and saying, how am I going to learn these skills? Are these in my law school classes? I mean, I think that's a big open question.
Right. And I do think the schools and the ABA have been encouraging more of this kind of experiential learning. So in a way, I think in theory, the NextGen is probably a good idea. You're testing people more on what they should have been learning in law school and also more on what they'll be doing in practice to some extent. But I think right now there are just a lot of open questions, and that's kind of the stressor on this exam right now for everyone.
Yeah. So it's important that everybody be anchored in the timeline for the NextGen because it's super important. So the first administration of this test will be in the summer of 2026. But the first wave of jurisdictions that will be using the NextGen, kind of the biggest ones, I think, are Washington and Oregon. That's the ones that I hear people talk about the most. Of course, we've got Connecticut, Maryland, and then very small jurisdictions, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Palau, the Northern Mariana Islands, Missouri, which also doesn't have a ton of folks that take the bar. But I think that Idaho.
Probably not a huge bar state.
Not a huge bar.
In numbers wise.
No, exactly. But Washington and Oregon, I think, are those larger jurisdictions, and maybe Maryland. And that's going to kind of be where a lot of folks are focusing their attention. if you're not studying for one of those jurisdictions and you're in law school right now, you're not off the hook because the rollout will continue with another at least 13 jurisdictions for the summer of 2027. And then by this July 2028, you've got like most everybody, another 18 in July, you've got 3 more in February 2028, but they're basically going to roll out the rest of it. And they've encouraged everyone to adopt the UBE because, they've encouraged everyone to adopt the NextGen because they're going to stop giving the UBE and the MBE specifically, the multiple choice portion. So it's a bit like get on the train or you don't have a bar.
Right. The drop dead date is basically July 2028. At that point, NCBE will not let you use the multiple choice question separately. So if you are, say, California, you might decide to write your own. We saw how well that went in February. So there's a pretty big incentive for all the states to get on board at least by July 2028. But some are, postponing until that last possible minute.
Yeah. So, depending on where you think you might practice law, you really want to be aware of what these dates are. You want to be aware of what your bar exam is going to look like. And, I think especially for these large jurisdictions like New York, where I feel like most people know if they're going to sit for the New York bar, make sure that you are very aware and you're talking to your law school about what they're going to do to help you prepare. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But I think if I was in law school right now, I'd want to make sure that I know when this next gen is coming for me. And I would be asking my bar prep services or my academic support office, hey, what's the plan? How are you going to help us get ready for this brand new test?
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts. So the NextGen is going to have 3 main components. First, you've got your multiple choice questions. Originally, it sounded like those were going to be really different than the MBE. It sounds like they're going to be pretty similar. I mean, in some cases, they're introducing a little bit of a new format where instead of 4 with 1 answer, you're going to have 6 with 2, but you're going to have a lot of multiple choice questions. These subjects generally are going to be like the big 7 of the MBE. So you've got your con law, contracts, crim law and procedure, evidence, real property, torts, and civ pro. In terms of content, they're also changing the content. So they're reducing the number of topics, getting rid of things like everyone's favorite secure transactions. But they're not really getting rid of that much. And a lot of it does require memorization. So you can find the content outlines. They have starred topics that you have to memorize, other topics you need to be familiar with. There's a little bit of a flux around business associations and family law, wills and trusts. These are all kind of being incorporated in different ways.
Yeah. It was interesting that yesterday I was speaking to someone who had a friend who sat for one of these practice exams, which they'd asked people to do after they sat for the traditional UBE. And the initial feedback from that student was, I felt incredibly prepared for this test, which I thought was interesting because then I was like, yes, but you memorized all of the law because you were taking the traditional UBE. And so I do think it's interesting. One of the pain points here for our folks is going to be figuring out like what these new content outlines actually mean. What does it mean to have a topic be starred versus what does it mean for a topic not to be starred? How much information do you need? Because they've been testing this with a population of students recently who have just taken the full bar, which means that they memorized all of this stuff of all of these subjects. So there was no differentiation in how they studied. They still didn't study these legal skills necessarily, but their substantive knowledge, I think, was a lot broader than a lot of the folks who will be maybe taking this test for the first time. And so it's just going to be interesting to see how people feel when they take it, if they have studied in a different way than has traditionally been the way that folks have studied, with just learning, mountains and mountains of substantive law.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the big prep companies treat this, because traditionally they haven't done the greatest job about having kind of a hierarchy of what's important and what's not important. There's some topics that show up over and over, and then there are others that maybe could make an appearance possibly. So I just think it's going to be, I agree. I think it's going to be interesting to see what they're telling people they need to memorize versus not memorize and how they're going to handle that. Because, it is a different set of information and a different set of skills.
I keep going back to when we help folks prepare for an open note test or an open book test, because this is not going to be an open note or open book test as traditionally it is. But in a way, you almost have to prepare for those tests as if you have most of it memorized. Maybe you have reference points, but you still have to have a deep understanding of the law, how it functions. And so when I read these content outlines, I'm scratching my head a little bit and saying, is it more like that open book, open note test that you might have in law school, where you need to have high familiarity with all of these topics? Or, are we really, like, what is our definition of, of these terms? And we don't have very many samples. So unfortunately, a lot of us are guessing going forward.
I guess I suspect it's sort of a situation where you might need to understand the general context of a rule, but maybe you don't memorize the rule itself because they're going to give you a statute, in a situation of evidence or civ pro or even crim, where you can give somebody a piece of the model penal code and let them deal with the statute itself without necessarily having to memorize like all the elements. But you're going to need context to understand what that statute is telling you. It's not like, oh, I've never heard of murder.
Well, yeah, that would be. I think that's
murder's a star topic anyway. Yeah,
I don't have that content list memorized, but I'm pretty sure murder is a star
But say, for example, maybe there's some intentional tort that's not like a primary intentional tort, but they can give you the statute on it, and you're like, okay, cool, I can apply it. It's something like that. It's not like you don't need to know what an intentional tort is or how it operates.
Yeah, like trespass to chattels.
Yeah, something like that, where you're like, nobody needs. I mean, who remembers that?
No. Okay, so we talked about the substantive changes and the uncertainty around there. And then we've got still other parts of the test.
Yeah.
So they do keep the performance test, and it feels a lot like the performance test that you've been practicing. Maybe if you've taken the test before, you've seen them. Those were 90 minutes, and now this is going to be 60 minutes. And although it will feel very familiar, they are also getting a bit more creative with the tasks and what you're being asked. And so it isn't necessarily going to be a long written assignment, such as the MPT was used in the UBE. Again, we only have 2 examples of these that are publicly available. So we're making assumptions off of 2 examples, as everyone is. But I do think that, students should find that it feels familiar because they are giving you the information. They're giving you the law. They're giving you the facts. They're giving you some sort of a task. I think this is the part that's going to feel very familiar to bar takers.
Right. Other than the one that is incorporating legal research skills.
Oh, that's true. That was a bit different.
That was a little quirky. So that's sort of like we give you all this stuff, but then we ask you like really specific questions about what you might want to research. So I think that's going to require, some getting used to. It's not impossibly hard necessarily, but you don't want to show up to the test never having seen something like that.
Yeah. And then the last piece is what people are spending most of their time talking about, which are these integrated question sets, or IQS. And we have another podcast specifically on the integrated question sets where we walk through our own example of what we believe these will look like. But this is going to feel very different. This is somewhere where they will be testing a little bit of your knowledge of the law, but they will also be providing you with statutes or facts. It's something very different, and you're going to have some short answers, some multiple choice, and some longer kind of medium length answers. They're going to be, you might have to draft something. You might have to make a list of 5 options. It's very different. And they're 24 minutes. Every time I talk about this, the 24 minutes just really bothers me. Like 25 minutes, folks, 25 minutes. Why 24? Do you like even numbers? I don't understand. But 24 minutes for each of these sets. There are a couple publicly available. If you're considering studying for this bar, you should download them and read them because they feel very different. And as we talk about in our other podcast, which we'll link to, I think for some students, especially anyone who struggles with working memory, anyone who struggles with kind of abstract tasks, this section is going to be a little bit of a mind bender.
Yeah, it definitely feels pretty weird when you first sit down to do them. Your brain is just like, what are you even asking me? I mean, I feel like, again, like once you do enough of them, you're probably going to feel more comfortable. But again, I definitely not that anyone would do this, but I would not show up to the exam not having looked at these because they are pretty bizarre.
Yeah, they're very different. And one of the things that got me when I was sitting down to do them was, they'll ask for 5 things, but they feel very abstract, like a bit open-ended. And I wasn't 100% sure what my answers should be. Was I like citing to statutes?
Right.
Was I just making a list? Did I have to have like a because statement? Like if I was doing a mini IRAC? I mean, there's still some uncertainty about what these score sheets are going to say, so the graders know how to evaluate. I love the fact that with the traditional bar, we could say, it needs to be a CREAC, it needs to be an IRAC, analysis is the most important. And here it's not exactly clear how all of that's going to be calculated, especially into some of these short answer questions.
Right. And also the answers they provided are internally inconsistent in that some of them cite to a statute and some of them don't, when both of them could. So that leaves a lot of open questions. Hopefully those will be resolved. But just around really what the expectation is, and I think that's the difficult piece with some of these newer type of questions, is it's just very hard to tell what they're actually like going to get points to and not get points to.
Yeah. So most folks who will be taking the NextGen are in law school right now. And we mentioned earlier in the podcast that you should be talking to your law schools because hopefully your law schools have a team that is working on this. And
Yes.
And if they are not,
you.
then you should ask if they would start. Because I would hope that many law schools are talking to faculty, are working on updating their bar prep classes that are part of their curriculum, since the ABA allows you to get units for taking a class that helps to prepare you for the bar. That those are being updated. But let's talk about like what's being asked of schools. Schools are having to write their own practice questions, which is not their skill set, or they have to spend money contracting with a bar provider who's been drafting practice questions because there's not a lot of information out there. There are not a lot of examples, and I think that's asking a lot of the schools.
Yeah, and I think we're hearing that there's some pushback from professors who are like, I teach a doctrinal class. I don't know why I would incorporate client counseling into my class. Isn't that a different class? Which is valid. People are already, they have their syllabus, they're working through the material, they're already short on time. Like, how are they going to add in these other components? And a lot of the testing thus far, a number of schools has been based on the bar because they want students to be prepared for the bar that they were going to be taking. And now all that's a little bit, in flux. So I do think it's going to be difficult for the schools to sort of figure this out. But, definitely push on that. And what resources are they providing for you? And, even if it's just a series of workshops about what might be coming down the pipeline, I think that would be valuable to just go through some of these questions in a workshop with people at your school to, kind of show you like, okay, this is what we think they're looking for.
And law schools are notoriously terrible at change. They do not like change. Lawyers do not like change. We are a risk-averse being that doesn't like change or ambiguity. That is like not where these bureaucracies live. And I think there are some schools that are being really thoughtful about this and really trying to get ahead of the curve. There are going to be schools that are not, and it may take some student pressure to let them know that their student body is expecting that they jump on this.
Yeah, because, it's such a change. I mean, parts of it are not a huge change, but the parts that are a change are a really big change. So I think everybody's, like we said, we're all working through it together. Anyone who tells you they know exactly what this is lying. Obviously the bar prep companies are writing questions and things as quickly as they can. It's all speculation. As more materials are released, then we can calibrate more exactly like, okay, it seems like they do want a citation or not. But right now, it's up in the air. That's the reality.
Yeah. We get the question a lot when folks call us to talk to them about their bar choices. Is this going to be easier?
Right. I think that's kind of been the view. Well,
yeah.
I think I'm not sure that maybe they presented it as being easier. I do think the expectation before we really saw the exam was, it's going to be easier. It's going to be shorter. It's going to require a lot less memorization. It's going to require you to know fewer topics. They were claiming it wasn't going to be super time pressured, and that was one of the things that they really wanted to work on. I'm not sure a lot of that has really come to pass. We've talked to people who've been working with students in law school, and the time pressure for a lot of people is a real thing. I think these open-ended questions can just really cause a lot of people to spiral, and you're just not sure what you're looking for, and you're going back to stuff, and time is passing. So I don't know that it's going to be easier per se. Yeah. And the reality is they keep adding topics back in that they took out. So
yeah. So ask us 5 years from now. Yeah. It is interesting. I think it also is interesting to think about how this test really, doesn't feel like a lot of the standardized tests that we have taken over the years, starting with like the SAT, where you have one right answer. I think this idea that you could have multiple right answers on a multiple choice question is very new to most people. And, it's going to take a very long time for law schools to test in a different way. So you've kind of learned this other way of testing, this issue spotter way of testing. And I think that's going to be a challenge. There's a lot of novelty here, and novelty is stressful. Like, we know that novelty is one of the things that makes a situation more stressful. And so if you're an anxious person and you don't like novelty, like, this is not going to feel easier. Whether or not people are more successful in this test is an open question, because we don't have a lot of data on that. We won't until people start preparing for it and taking it. So I wouldn't get sucked into this narrative that it's easier. It is just different. Yep. And I also think it is going to possibly be very challenging for certain students who, whose brains work certain ways. We talked about like the necessity for a lot of working memory. I think for ADHD students, who really need very strict rules around how long to spend on an individual question and how to track their time and constantly checking in. This more abstract timing of especially the integrated question sets of, okay, well, you have 24 minutes. Again, thanks for that. 24 minutes, but you may have 4 questions. You may have 5 questions. You may have 2 questions. You may have 3 questions. You may have 1. We don't know. And I think that is going to be challenging for folks who need a very set plan of how to attack a question and a lot of scaffolding to hold to that plan, even with extended time. I do think that's going to be challenging.
Yeah, and also it's completely on the computer, so you're going to have to be going back and forth in Windows, and there's no scratch paper. Like, they're just things that are going to make this more difficult, even if certain changes of the content theoretically made it less challenging. So on balance, I think it depends kind of on the person. But, if you're thinking about which test to take, we're going to do a whole other episode on that, and the pros and cons and who it's good and bad for. But yeah, I wouldn't say across the board is easier, because frankly, it depends on where states put the pass score. I mean, they can pass the same amount of people percentage wise that they do now just by setting their pass score wherever they want.
Yeah. And we saw that in California, folks. Yeah. This is a game that has been played. Like, in California around the pandemic, they lowered the pass rates, or the pass score. Like, the scoring in California is very different, but it was a substantial reduction in order to, in theory, pass more people. And then the pass rate has pretty much held.
Yeah.
So
I don't think it's going to be that suddenly 95% of the people in every state pass the bar, because that's not honestly what the bar is used for. Mm-hmm. It's used to keep people out of the profession, not let them in. So I don't think you can just walk away being like, oh, I need to, prepare a lot less time. This is going to be super easy. I can just roll out of bed and take this test. I don't think that's accurate.
Yeah. I will make one more comment about some things folks need to be aware of, especially with this idea of score portability, which has been one of the big things that the UBE did. Is it made it very easy to move around much of the country as a lawyer. Although each state has its own pass rates, and they can be extremely different, from like a 260 to over 280. It's a pretty big range. Yeah. We don't know what score portability is exactly going to look like during this transition time. And so if you are assuming that you will have score portability, make sure that you sign up for NCBE emails, talk to your law school so you have all that information, because there's going to be a time of transition, and I wouldn't want anyone to make assumptions and then get caught up in this time of transition and not be able to move their scores where they thought they could.
Yeah, definitely. I think you just want to be aware of what's happening. I don't think anyone needs to panic at this point.
No.
You know, this is still quite far off in the future. Not that far, but somewhat far off in the future, even if you were to take the very first test. So if you are thinking that you might be in that cohort, you definitely want to be sort of looking at what's been released, understanding the test, getting your resources together, pressing your law school on things that they can do to help you. But I think it's going to be, like you said, we're just going to have to see what happens on a lot of this.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, we're going to keep talking about this because it's a big change in the bar exam world. We will continue to have recommendations and resources for you. We have a future episode coming up on which test you should take, whether you should take the UBE or the NextGen if you have an option. We also have episodes, as I mentioned, around the integrated question sets and talking about the different parts of the exam in more detail. So we'll link to all of those in the show notes. We're here for you. We're all in it together. And
it's going to be okay.
It's going to be okay. And just remember, everyone's in the same boat. Anyone
Right.
who's planning to sit for July 2026, this new exam, everyone sitting with you will be in the same boat. And that's the pool of people that you're really going to be judged against. And I think that's important to remember.
Right, because, you know, like we always say, regardless of what the exam looks like, a certain percentage of people, probably a fairly consistent percentage, are going to pass the test. So you just want to do what you can to be in that group. And I think that's totally doable.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a like, leave us a comment, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content.
You can check out barexamtoolbox.com for more information.